We are now moving to Mark Howard Ross. He is Professor of Political Science at Bryn Mawr College. He's been there since 1968. He's done research across the world. And I remember one of the early books he wrote, which was The Culture of Conflict and the Management of Conflict from 1993. He has written numerous other articles and books. And Mark will speak a little bit about the conceptual aspects of GPI.
Thank you very much. I'm from New York, so I learned to talk fast as a kid. And I'll try to not exceed my time allocation and hope that you can understand what I have to say. I like the ideas and the efforts behind the project, and I'm going to make some comments that sound critical around conceptual and methodological things, but it's in the goal of trying to improve this, not to say this is not a worthwhile effort. But I will touch on what I think are some limits to this, project. One thing I like a lot is studying successes. I think that too many people only study failures. I'm going to come back to this. But I think that we need to study successes for theoretical reasons, because we learn things from successes we don't learn from just looking at the failures. And secondly, for political reasons. I study ethnic conflict. And you'd be amazed at the number of audiences. I simply ask people, give me some successes in the settlement of ethnic conflicts. And people are just paralyzed. They can't think of any conflict that's ever been settled. And I think that's because they think if it was settled, it wasn't much of a conflict to begin with. Totally circular. So we have to sell the idea that in fact, places change. And I like the 23 components. I have a lot of little quibbles, but I'm not going to go into them. I think the students touched on them in a lot of ways. I actually think that in some ways that sometimes they're good measures of peace, low violence, low conflict, whichever way you want to draw that. But some measures, social, economic, and political practices that are often claimed to be the results of achieving peace, like respect for human rights or trust in other citizens. And I think that one bleeds into the other, and it's something I want to touch on, which is I think if we're going to have a good definition of peace, it also has to be limited. It can't be everything. And I think sometimes, especially in the writing, it's not always clear what's peace and what's a correlative peace. Another thing I want to touch on are the unit of analysis problems in these kind of cross-national studies, and I've worked on a lot of them. One dilemma to me is that China is a case of one, and so is Cyprus. The population sizes are quite different, and I would like sometime to maybe see weighting by population size or territorial size, because I think we can get a misreading of what the relationships are in the international system when we can have the 25 smallest countries that only comprise, I don't know what the percentage is, but 4% of the population or even less, counting just as much as the 25 largest ones. And a second thing is the assumption that these cases are independent. That's what sampling is about. And the fact is they're sovereign, but only up to a certain point, as we know. And they are certainly not independent, because there's a tremendous amount of diffusion or borrowing, and we see this particularly in the regional effects. Regions look distinctive, and if we have time, I would like to say more about that. Paul Collier, in writing about growth and development, talks about neighbors matter. Countries do well when they have good neighbors. Now, that's a little bit not a very manipulable variable. How do you choose good neighbors? But it gets us to be alert to the problem of seepage across boundaries and limits to the nation state as the unit of analysis. Some other concerns. My greatest unease in reading the papers and the methodology, and I went back and found some other things on the website, is the kind of blurring of correlation and cause. At some level, people are clear. At the other time, they're often used very interchangeably. And peace includes sometimes, in addition to 33 other measures, as well as the 23 indicators. What's missing, though, from much of this is really searching for the causes or the roots of peace. They certainly will vary across countries and regions. They're hard to measure in cross-national studies. But there's not much here that tells me how do you get peace. It tells me who's there now. And it tells me what some structural variables are that are correlated with them. But since I'm confused, particularly on what is the relationship that's involved, I don't know where to go with it. So does good governance and wealth cause peace? Sometimes it seems to. Does it result from peace? Well, sometimes it seems to do that. Or maybe there are third variables and some various process variables that are not particularly measured that in fact cause both. And until we can move to the studies of saying, how do you go from being high in conflict and violence to low in that, then I don't think that we've really answered a crucial question in this project. And the 4 years of data, and the tiny shifts that occur in this 4 years for the most part in most countries aren't enough of a time frame to do this. And so there are other data sets that can be brought in to look back 20 and 40 years. There's a lot of circularity that results from this. So there's somewhere on page 25 in the 2010 paper that says peace includes well-functioning government, the concept of peace is often extended to other structural features or values of society. They include well-functioning government, sound business environment, respectful human rights, good relations with neighboring states, high freedom of information, high participation in education, low corruption, acceptance of rights of others, equitable sharing of resources. So is peace all these things? Is there something that comes first and something that comes later? So I found that the theory that's articulated still needs a lot of work. Now, another example is the problem of wealth and GDP, because it seems to be confounded with a lot of the measures of peace. But does that mean there are no poor, peaceful societies? My cross-cultural studies, looking at small ethnographic cases, certainly find there are a lot of them. And here there's a bias. Well, you want to have high education, you want to have a lot of these things, you want to have strong functioning education. Well, just get a lot of wealth. And I think that's a mistake for a lot of reasons conceptually. 1 minute, oh my God. All good things don't come together. And you've touched on it in some of the papers. Just touch on the fact that competitive elections sometimes are problems. And Roland Paris had a really good book that he published about 5 years ago, where he suggests that we made a big mistake pushing liberalization after 1990 in UN peacekeeping operations and in other domains. Because, he says, until you have institutionalization, you can't contain elections that can be highly competitive and divisive. So he suggests IBL, institution before liberalization, rather than the other way around. In this regard, we need more multivariate analyses. A couple of very fast things. Why is the index created in a way that's always confusing? If we're really valuing peace, shouldn't the most peaceful societies have the higher scores? It would make it a lot easier reading the correlations at times when I'm converting both variables, and it would be a very welcome change, especially for naive readers. The same variables are listed in different orders in different tables. Tiny shifts in scores, a correlation of 0.6 that goes to 0.61 in the next year is talked about. That's junk. There's no change. Focus on the things that really change, and otherwise just say these things have been much more constant. Lastly, I just want to say, emphasize process. We've got to put process in here. We have to know how countries move up and move down. A place like Northern Ireland changed a tremendous amount in recent years. South Africa did too, in a variety of ways. And we need to be able to map this cross-nationally, and I don't think these measures do that very well. Last point, and then I will absolutely stop, is the scores for the largest countries. None of the large countries in the world are very peaceful on these measures. And there's this situation where the US is not very good, Japan is great, but there's a curious kind of thing. US military provides security arrangements for Japan. So it lowers the US score. Japan gets a great score. But that's not exactly the right image of the world. Same thing with Scandinavia. They're in NATO. For the most part, are protected by NATO. So I think we have to see this diffusion and connection among countries as part of the dilemma of doing cross-national data collection rather than, oh, well, the US, Russia, China, et cetera, they all stink.
Thank you very much, Mark. Really appreciated you speaking so quickly.
I had a lot more, too.
Yeah. and I thought the peace-building group, the peace-building presentation, I thought maybe you wanted to think about that. They talked about whether there was a moral judgment really in this GPI on liberal democratic peace, perhaps. So that's one thing to consider.